Rhetorical Quest.
Hi, Dr. Benjamin Klein again, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about kind of the history of communication. I'm going to give you like a great deal of history. It's thousands of years of history in just a few minutes, and so I want you to follow along with what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the history of rhetoric. And what I consider the history of rhetoric, the history of communication, and the history of rhetoric are all tied together. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the history and the canons of rhetoric. So in order to do that, we're going to really cover three things. We're going to cover, first of all, the classical period, which lasted from about 467 BC to 1411. So about 1,878 years. We'll talk about how that started with the Sophists, Socrates and Plato, Aristotle, Roman rhetoric, and then the Christianization of rhetoric. So after that, we'll move on to modern rhetoric, 1411 to 1844 or 1897. And it's really a question as to how long this lasted. But it's over 400 years, and it includes what we call the belletristic movement, the epistemologists, and the elocutionists. Then I'm going to talk about postmodern rhetoric, which I have as 1844 to present. It's not even 200 years, and involves an expansion of rhetoric and cultural rhetoric. So let's go ahead and get started. We want to really talk about where the formal study of rhetoric took place. We have to go here to the Mediterranean. Now, we want to be honest about this. There has been rhetoric in everywhere, all over the world from the beginning. But a formal study of rhetoric, and in fact, the name rhetoric, comes from really Greece, and really starts out. A lot of people place the beginnings of it really on this island. This island is Sicily, which was a Greek colony in 467 BC. And there was at that time a man named Corax. And what Corax did is he did what most people did. Sicily was an Athenian colony. And in Athens, what they would do is most of the time people would show up on the agora, and they would sue each other, and they would be sued by each other. Athens really didn't have like a civil code the way we would a criminal code the way we'd understand it today. Most things were handled civilly, and so Corax would go in, and he would sometimes be in the jury, and he would sometimes sue people, and he would sometimes be sued by people. And what he figured out in all of this was that some people won more often than others. And so he started to keep track of that. Why is it that some people win more often than others? And what are some of the tools people are using? What are some of the techniques that they're using? And so Corax figured that out, and he tried it out, and it seemed to work pretty well. And so eventually he opened a school. And in that school, among the students who came right away was a student named Tisias, who came to learn how to win in court. And Corax gave him the class, and at the end he said, okay, now Tisias, you need to give me the money. I taught you the class, and now you have to pay me. And Tisias said, I'm not going to pay you. And Corax says, look, here's the deal that we agreed to. I would teach you the class, and then you would give me the money. And Tisias says, no, I'm not going to give you the money. And so Corax sued Tisias. And Tisias argued in court that if Corax had properly taught him how to win in court, then Tisias would win today, and he would not have to pay. If he had not taught him how to win in court, then he didn't do what he had promised to do, and so Tisias didn't have to pay. And either way, Tisias wouldn't have to pay. This was brilliant, and Corax recognized it as brilliant. And right away, they decided to go to work together, teaching this concept of communication, which really at that time was how to win in court. But it didn't take very long before people started to realize that it wasn't just how to win in court, that these same techniques worked for how to win in politics and how to win in sales, how to get the things that you want, how to make your argument seem like it's the strongest. And so some of the first sophists, and that's what we call these people, who followed after Corax and Tisias and started to teach these techniques and methods, some of the first sophists developed in these Greek colonies at this time. And among them were people like Gorgias, Protagoras, Prodicus, Hippias, Thrasymachus, who you probably read about in some of your student at WNMU, some of your applied liberal arts courses. You've read about these people, and you're aware of the kind of teaching they had. And one thing that I think is really, really a good example, if I'm just going to give a short example of what the sophists taught, comes from one of Gorgias's work called the Encomium of Helen. And an encomium is kind of a defense. It's a defense of Helen. And he was defending Helen of Troy, who very famously, her husband was visited by a Persian prince, and the Persian prince did business with her husband. And then when he went back to Persia, specifically the city of Troy in Persia, he took Helen along with him, which caused a whole bunch of fighting to take place. And in fact, the big Trojan War, which was probably one of the largest wars that had taken place in Greece up until that time. They wrote songs about it, books about it. We're still learning more about the Trojan War today. It was a really big deal. So a lot of people blamed Helen for that, because if she just stayed home with her husband, none of these issues would have happened. But Gorgias made an argument. He argued that it really wasn't Helen's fault that she had left, that the Trojan prince, the Persian prince, had used language on her. He'd told her, how wonderful she was, how amazing she was, how beautiful she was, and how wonderful her life would be if she just was his wife instead of her husband's wife. And when somebody talks to you like that, if they use really good communication techniques, really good public speaking techniques, it's not their fault if they get brought into it. And he uses this phrase, he says, the effect of speech upon the soul is comparable to the power of drugs on the body. And he says, we wouldn't have argued that Helen was such a bad lady if she'd been drugged. We wouldn't have made that argument. So, it's not your fault if somebody takes advantage of you when you're drugged. That's not your fault. That's their fault. That's them being scum, not you being scum. And so Gorgias made this argument that the power of speech is comparable to the power of drugs. This was a really interesting thing because, first of all, he is defending Helen in a way that makes sense to probably a lot of his readers. And second of all, he's selling his speech classes, because he's saying, if you study speech on this level, then the effect of speech on your soul is going to be comparable to the power of drugs on the body. You'll have power like somebody who can secretly administer drugs. And that is a really interesting thing. And it's also a bad thing, right? Why would we teach somebody like that? Why would we teach somebody to be messing with people that way? And that became a pretty serious issue. Became a pretty serious issue, especially as it started to filter back to the mainland Greece and especially to Athens. In Athens, S is a little off here, Socrates. But anyway, I'll need to fix that. Socrates was a man who lived in Athens. And what would happen was he would get into these arguments with the Sophists. And what he would do is he would try and show that the stuff that they were teaching was kind of messed up. That, they could make lies look like truth. They could convince people that their lies were true. That they could make weaker arguments seem stronger. That they could appear smarter than they are. That they could talk about things of which they had no knowledge and make people believe that they were knowledgeable. And this really is not okay. And so Socrates would point that out. And anybody who was listening, he would point that out to them. And this kind of ticked off those Sophists. Now, other people found it entertaining, especially young men who were following Socrates around, listening to him. They thought that it was fun when these Sophists could be put in their place. These pompous, arrogant jerks could be put in their place. They thought that was fun. And so they enjoyed listening to Socrates, and they enjoyed all that. But the Sophists themselves didn't like it. And so they did what Sophists do. They took Socrates to court. And when they took Socrates to court, they took him to court and they sued him. And they sued him they said he was corrupting the youth, these people who were following him. They said he was an atheist because he did have some really kind of interesting ideas about godhood, questions as to whether gods could have done bad things like they did in many of the myths and stuff like that. So they accused him of atheism. He believed in gods that were infinitely good. And so that was atheism to them. And they accused him of a few others, that corrupting the youth and atheism and stuff like that. And so they won. And when they won, what they sued him for was to make him kill himself, to drink hemlock and die, and he did. And that ticked some of these young men off. Among the young men that it ticked off was one of these young men who looks old in this picture because he is older than the other young man. One of these young men was Plato. Plato was really ticked off by this. And Plato wasn't the sort of man you'd want to really tick off. Plato wasn't even his real name. It's what we know him by. But that meant shoulders. He had been an Olympic wrestler and was famous for having big shoulders and being able to win in a fight and being tough. And so you would have thought that he would have dealt with those Sophists when he was mad. But as an Olympic wrestler, another thing was true about him. He was also quite wealthy. Because he was quite wealthy, he could afford to write books. Now, writing books at this time was an extremely expensive proposition. Paper hadn't been invented yet. Parchment was hundreds of years off. Way more than that. Many hundred years off. So they didn't even have parchment. What they wrote on was this thing called papyrus. And papyrus is really, really super expensive. So you could write something, but then you would have the only copy of it. So to write it and get several copies out to people, this was a very expensive proposition, but Plato did it. And as he did that, one of the things that he kind of noticed was that some of these techniques that the Sophists were using to do things that were really, really awful, Socrates was using to move things in a direction that was really good. And so Plato came up with this idea that rhetoric, public speaking, is not an art for itself. It's not an art in and of itself. And in fact, it can be a very evil art. Being a good communicator can be a very evil thing if you're an evil person. But if you're moving speech in the service of truth, if you're using your communication to do the right thing, it's good. And this is really important. It's made this concept of morality and ethos kind of a central thing in the study of communication. And so we haven't stopped that. You know, there are different arguments about what is truth. Again, if you're a WNMU student, a Western New Mexico University students, you know that's one of our 4 basic questions is what is truth? And why do we answer that truth? Because if we're going to communicate honestly, then we need to at least know what the truth is and communicate it well. One of Plato's students was a guy named Aristotle. Aristotle studied Plato's work, read Plato's books, and had conversations with Plato. And he wrote a whole bunch of books. Lots of books that we would look at right now, and books like the Metaphysics and all kinds of books that don't really matter to communication. But he wrote 4 really closely related books that in communication, they kind of provide a foundation for a lot of our thinking. Those books are the Ethics, or the Nicomachean Ethics, which was an interesting book. See, one difference between Aristotle and Plato was this idea. Plato said communication is good as long as you're in the service of truth. And how do you know what is true? Well, what Plato said is, well, I have this demon living in me. And this demon always tells me what's good. And so as long as he's telling me what's good, because he always wants me to do good things. And so as long as he's telling me this is good, I know he's good. And you might say, well, that sounds crazy. That's probably just because I use the word demon, because that's etymologically the word that Plato used to describe the spirit that lived in him that told him what was good. But it still kind of comes up today. You know, people say, my conscience won't let me live with this. People say, God won't let me live with this. And kind of before there was ethics, that was kind of how morality was. Is you had some powerful being, a king or a god or a demon, and that person would tell you what was right and wrong. And how do you know what's right and wrong? Because they told you. Aristotle says, well, that's great, but I don't have a demon living in me. So he came up with another system that he called the ethics, where you could figure out for yourself what was right and wrong. Which is a really interesting system. And it's been important to the study of communication. Once you figure out what is right and wrong for you as an individual, you then move on to how can we then inculcate goodness into the city in which we live? How can we make this a good city? And that is the politics. The politics are about how we can once we figure out what goodness is, what is the good life, what is justice. Again, for those of you at WNMU, you know these are some of our core questions. Once we figure that out, then we can figure out how to have a city that encourages the good life, to have laws that promote justice. And then, if we have that city and we have those laws, we will need to convince people to do what is good and to follow those laws and to adopt good laws. And for that, we'll need the Rhetoric. The Rhetoric is the most important book of these 4. as far as the study of communication goes. And probably as far as the study of communication goes, Aristotle's On Rhetoric is the most important book ever written. Everything else that we do flows out of On Rhetoric. If you go get a copy of On Rhetoric at your bookstore or anything like that, maybe you should if you're really interested in the study of communication. You'll find it's almost always packaged in the same cover as Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle's Poetics is not only about how we can speak movingly, which was what the rhetoric is really about, how we can move people towards goodness, but also about how we can do it beautifully. So to move people towards good policies beautifully is really what these 4 books are about. And there's a large extent to which that's what communication still is. How can we move people towards what's good and do it beautifully? Now, Aristotle defined rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case all the available means of persuasion. There are lots of ways that you can persuade people. There are ethical and unethical ways. There are easy and difficult ways. You can persuade people using different methods and different media, but figuring out what those are and using the best one, and not just the best one in terms of the most functional, but the best one in terms of which one is the most good. And with that, you can move people forward. Aristotle also began the process of what we call canonizing rhetoric. When you canonize something, when you make a canon of something, what you're doing is you're making a thing where you can say, this is all what we're talking about. And every discipline has a canon, right? If I want to talk about biology, right? If I want to study biology, I don't go and figure out the temperature of a turbine on a hydroelectric dam. That's science, still science, but it's not biology, right? If you want to study biology, you study the living things. And so every discipline has kind of the canon. And Aristotle started to figure out, when we're studying communication, when we're studying rhetoric, what is it that we're studying? And that's really what canonizing is. And so when I talk about the canons of rhetoric, that's what I mean. It comes from a Greek word meaning law or rule. Sometimes people will talk about the canon of scripture, which are those, I can write a book about God. I can. But that won't be accepted as really being the Bible, except by crazy people. And I can assure you that if I ever write anything and people start to think it's the Bible, they're crazy. Well, I've written a lot of things, and if anybody sees those as the Bible, they're crazy. A canonized saint, your mom is probably a saint. She puts up with you. But if you go to a church that venerates saints, an Orthodox and Episcopalian, the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, and say, I would like to put up a statue to this saint, and it's your mom, they're going to say no, because your mom might be a saint, but she's not a canonized saint, not an official saint. Sometimes a priest who studies the canon is called a canon. There's canon law. There's a musical canon, which is when they take all of the possible chords that can be played without any additional sharps and flats within a particular key signature, and usually in a beautiful way. The Western canon are those books that we talk about as being really, really important to Western civilization. The Star Wars canon, there's a whole bunch of Star Wars books, right, that contradict the official Star Wars canon. And so, they're basically licensed fan fiction. And that's not the canon. And now we talk about the canons of rhetoric. Canons of rhetoric, Aristotle developed the first thing. One of the things that we can talk about when we talk about communication is how do you come up with something to talk about? And Aristotle called this the canon of invention. He divided it up into 3 parts. Nowadays, we mostly emphasize the second 2. The first was topics. And we still use this a little bit. I have a couple of books right up there that called a synopticon. The synopticon is kind of a list of really everything that we could talk about. And you do that by kind of making it vague and saying, there are really just these things that people could talk about. There really isn't anything else. Then we have what he called the inartistic proofs. Inartistic proofs are what you might call proof. The inartistic proofs are those things that you can point to outside of yourself that you can say, well, here's the proof. Here's a document. Here's how do I know I'm a licensed driver? Well, you know what? Here's my driver's license. How do I know I don't have COVID-19 right now? Okay, well, here's my negative score. This being made in early 2021. All these things. These are the ways that I can know these things. I can have this proof. But Aristotle says there's another kind of proof too that's really important when we're coming up with what to talk about. And that's what he called the artistic proofs. And these are proofs that don't come from outside you. They come from inside you. Things like your passions and your logical thinking and your character as a person. These things are inside you, and they provide a kind of proof. And Aristotle said even some of them provide a better proof. We'll talk about that in other videos and other times in the semester. Even provide a better proof than the physical proofs that you might be thinking of. But Aristotle didn't finish the process of canonizing rhetoric. He started it. And he died. But he did something really important before he died. Probably what I consider the most important thing that I do. And it was probably the most important thing that Aristotle did for all of his prolific writing and great thoughts. The most important thing that he did is he had students. And he had 2 students, or maybe it was just one, Philip of Macedon, who was from up in Macedonia. Anyway, the Philip of Macedon, and his son Alexander. Now, I can point to historical documents that say that Aristotle actually taught Alexander. He would have been really old when he did that. But Alexander became eventually known as Alexander the Great. Because what Alexander the Great did is he took over the whole world as far as he knew, which would be probably about that much. Well, maybe not so much of average, but about we can't really get as much as he knew of the world. He took it over, and so and everywhere he went, he made people do something. He made people learn Greek. He set up schools. So it's a smart thing to do if you're ever going to colonize and subjugate a people, is make them learn the language of their colonizers. It's been done over and over and over. That's what he did all through that area, is he forced people to learn Greek. And he forced them to read in Greek, and he forced them to read Aristotle's works. So he made copies of them and forced them to read them. Probably Plato's works too, and the works of some of the Sophists, especially there was a sophist, not Socrates, but Socrates, who was probably in the curriculum that Aristotle forced on people, to try and kind of bring, or not Aristotle, Alexander the Great forced on people to kind of bring it all together. So this is pretty important. Everybody was pretty much reading Greek. Everybody was pretty much understanding Plato and Aristotle and thinking about these Greek thinkers. But Alexander died, and he died without an heir. There's all kinds of speculation as to why that was, ranging from disease to the fact that, well, he had several wives. He may have only been interested in men. Different things that I've read at different times, different speculation. Nobody knows. We can't ask him, and there's nobody to interview. But we do know he died without any heir. And so because of that, his military leaders kind of took over after he died. But they divided up the empire, and it just never got really whole. But all of that area, people were reading Greek and studying Plato and Aristotle, which is really important. Because eventually there were a couple of people, there were some people in this area over here. Rome. Italy, Rome. The Romans finished the process of canonization. And I can look at some really wonderful Roman lists of the canons. I can think of Cicero. I can think of his On Oratory is a really good place. They're listed in Quintilian's the Institutio de Oratoria, all these different places. But one place where I think it's just super, super clearly laid out was in a book called the Rhetorica ad Herennium. If you go check it out in the WNMU library, it'll say the Rhetorica ad Herennium was written by Cicero. And he may have looked it over before it got published, but it was really by the students of Cicero. And they were kind of taking his lecture notes and using those to produce this book, the Rhetorica ad Herennium, which is a book on how to rhetoric. And it lays out the 5 canons. So when we talk about the study of communication, there's really 5 things that we can talk about. Invention, which basically they swiped out right from Aristotle. That's what the Romans did, is they took Greek things and improved them. So they took that right away from Aristotle. The canon of invention, the way Aristotle described it, is the canon of invention the way that the Romans described it. Arrangement. They taught a particular order in which to put people's thoughts. And if you go through this video series that I've got, you can find a couple of places where I talk about this order. And there is a way in which to put your ideas that makes it more likely that people will accept your ideas than if you put them other ways. There is a particular order. And in this video series, we talk about that order. Style is the use of language. Which words to use at what times with which people is the concept of style. Memory, you've got to remember what you're talking about, and you've got to remember, you want your listeners to remember it too. I don't know about you, but there have been times when I've walked away, especially I can think of at times in church where I've walked away thinking, that was a good sermon. And then my wife will say, well, I didn't, what was it about? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I'm sure it was good. Doesn't do you any good if nobody remembers what you talked about. And then delivery. Delivery are those nonverbal aspects of our communication. Everything from the fonts we use to the ways we gesture, the ways we hold our face, the ways we intone things. That's the canon of delivery. So the Romans spread their ideas all throughout the Mediterranean. All throughout it, they took over countries and they taught this study of communication. And the study of communication, they taught a lot of things. They taught some really advanced mathematics. They had some really interesting ideas in medicine that maybe were accurate. They had they had ideas in engineering that even today we look at it and we see the stuff they built and we're not quite sure how that worked. but they had some ideas in engineering. But a lot of that got lost, and there are a lot of reasons that got lost. I'm here in Germany. There were groups of people called the Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals who came down into Italy and started attacking Rome. So that's one of the things that really messed them up. They had their ideas on getting water to people were really great. They probably ended people dying of thirst, which was pretty common before that. But one of the things that they used was a lot of lead pipes, and so there got to be a lot of lead in the drinking water, which tends to make people stupid and violent. And so that kind of messed things up. Roman religion was really interesting. They had very much a civil religion, and that the ties between government and faith were really important to them. They saw themselves as specially chosen by the gods, and they saw their emperor as being a god himself. In fact, being the god himself was really important. But there got to be a lot of challenges from various cults from Asia and Africa coming in and destabilizing their civil religion. And since that was tied to their government, if they really saw their god and their country as being closely related, their gods and their country as being closely related things, that really then when there was challenges to the faith, those were also challenges to the government, and those caused problems. Also, it was a really big country, a really big empire, and it was really hard to keep track of it all. And just there got to be a lot of things. But one of those cults that kind of started to take off and started to be a real challenge to Roman rule was a cult that developed over in Israel. And this cult was really different than the Roman rhetoric at the time. A lot of the Roman religion at the time, and really a challenge to the emperor. One of the things that you had to do to interact in Rome is you had to toss some incense on an altar to Caesar and say that Caesar is the Lord. Not a Lord, and not just the Lord. Caesar is the Lord. And these people said, well, we can say Caesar's a Lord. He is. But we don't want to say he's the Lord, and their religion wouldn't allow that. Also, the religion was very much, the Roman religion was very much tied to wealth as a sign of favor from the gods. That if you're rich, it's because God likes you, and so if you want the gods to like you, you will suck up to rich people, and that didn't go over in this new religion where they were, taking care of the poor and the weak, and those that the Romans really felt should die. So it was a really big issue. It wasn't working off well. Temple prostitution was really important for the Roman religion. It was really important that people made use of these temples. It was very important to and this religion didn't allow their adherents to go to prostitutes. And of course, the religion that I'm talking about is Christianity. And Christianity at first was hesitant to accept the concepts of public speaking because of their pagan roots. Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Quintilian, all the people I've mentioned so far, of course, did not believe in a monotheistic God, and they had no understanding whatsoever of what the Christians saw as scripture. and they advocated some things that we would see. I would say that you would see, even if you're not a Christian, you would see as immoral because of the influence on Christianity in your life. Things where you would violate consent and autonomy, which are really very much Christian principles, that the Romans would not have liked at all. So this was the religion, was Christianity, but eventually they started to accept Christian notions of public speaking. And it really starts out at the beginning. There's one of the early writings in Christianity. It's actually considered part of the Christian canon, part of the Bible, part of the New Testament. Is a book called 1 Timothy 5:17. 1 Timothy says that it's written by Paul, who was a very important writer in Christianity, and Timothy was a very important early pastor in Christianity. So it's written by Paul to him. There's people who argue about that, but that's what it says. It says it was written by Paul. So if you're going to argue with that, well, you just think somebody else wrote it. So anyway, that's okay. But anyway, he said that the elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of a double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. Where the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing, and the laborer is worthy of his wages." Now, I don't know how much you make. I don't really care. I know how much I make. But I bet no matter how much you make, and I know this is certainly true of me, one amount that you'd like to have is double. I think you'd probably like double. Double's a wonderful amount to have. And so, to be one of those who's worthy of a double honor, that's a really great thing to have. And so preaching and teaching in Christianity, I think more than probably any of the other major religions in the world, public speaking is an important part of Christianity. In fact, even today, if you go to almost any Christian or Christian-influenced religious organization, you're going to probably hear somebody get up and give a speech called a sermon or a homily or something like that. Really, really important. And so public speaking became really important, but that didn't necessarily make them accept these pagan writers, Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, people like that. That really didn't come until just a little bit later. And that came from this guy. This guy is Augustine. Sometimes we'll call him Saint Augustine. Sometimes people call him Augustine, and I don't care. He's dead. He doesn't care how you pronounce his name. But anyway, Augustine was from Africa. That's why I like this picture of him, actually. This is a fresco done of him. And when it was done, there were people it was done after he was dead. But there were people who saw this fresco who also knew Augustine. And the reason I like this one is this is clearly not a white guy. And that's good because Augustine was from Africa and probably not a white guy. There's a lot of whitewashing of Western communication, Western civilization, where we imagine white people did all this stuff. Imagine Jesus was white, he wasn't. Imagine Augustine was white, he wasn't. But you can find pictures where they used a model from Europe during the time of the picture maker who is clearly white, and they say this is this guy. And you can find that of Augustine too. But I like this one because it is old, and people who looked at it would have known him, and it's not a white guy. Anyway, so Augustine was from Africa, and he was a communication teacher. He was a rhetoric teacher, just like me. And he became a really good one. Really, really good rhetoric teacher, actually. Made it to Rome and became like the premier teacher of rhetoric in Rome. And then he became a Christian. And when he became a Christian, he put away all the pagan stuff in which he was interested. And he argued that we should put away a lot of these pagan ideas and these pagan thoughts. But the more time he spent in church, the more he heard speeches that were just really poorly done. The people who were giving these speeches clearly were not trained public speakers, and he was. And so eventually he came to the conclusion that it was valuable to look at some of the stuff from what he called the City of Man, look at some of the stuff from the pagan rhetoricians about how to be a good public speaker, because Augustine felt like the purveyors of truth, which just goes back to Plato, right? What is truth? Well, he felt truth is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ and in the scriptures written by the apostles. What is truth? That the purveyors of truth should be able to speak as well as Satan's servants, the pagan rhetoricians. And Augustine was really, really important. Augustine made his way up through the church ranks, becoming an elder or bishop. The words were the same at that time. An elder or bishop, and eventually became known as the Bishop of Rome, which is the title we give to the Pope today. And it was kind of seen as this is the person who sits in the place of the apostles and can make people do things. Can interpret scripture for us and can tell us what God would want. And when Augustine was in that place, he made his priests study Cicero and Quintilian, Aristotle, probably Plato. He made them teach that, probably some of the Sophists too. He made them teach that because he wanted them to be good public speakers and good thinkers. There's a real tie between speaking and thinking, or to be a really good thinker, you should be a good communicator. And so that's really what he wanted. And so he made that happen. And that pretty much, and we're in the classical period here, we're starting to move. It wasn't long after Augustine that Rome fell completely apart and just wasn't really Rome anymore. Just completely fell apart. And eventually Christianity, Augustine's religion, became the official religion of the state, with some alterations to make it work for a state, but the official religion of the state. And once that happens, we pretty much find Aristotle and Plato being copied in monasteries throughout Europe, throughout Asia, throughout North Africa. And we can pretty much see this being like an end to what we call the classical era. And this is the way things would continue. This is the way things would continue well into the late Middle Ages. In the late Middle Ages, there was a technology that reached in 1411. This is a really important technology, and I've kind of mentioned it as we've gone through this video already, and that is the concept, the technology of paper. Now in China, they'd had paper for quite a while. They also had really massive empires built with paper. But once Europeans got paper, they started to apply some of the concepts that they had learned from communication to written communication. Now, some of it doesn't work. Delivery doesn't really work. Memory radically changes on paper because you can just go back and read it again if you don't remember, which you couldn't do with communication before then. Now, there had been papyrus, there had been writing, Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, they had all written books. but they had written it on papyrus, which was, like I said before, super, super expensive. Before we got paper, there had been parchment, which came into being, but every single piece of parchment is the thin skin of a dead goat, and so, or sheep. And so it was expensive even still, but paper is just plant pulp. Ground up together. It is very cheap to make. And so paper allows communication to be cheaply sent over large distances. And this began what we really would consider the age of empires. I'm living here in New Mexico, and there's a place up in Santa Fe, north of me, quite a bit north of me, called the Palace of the Governors. And it's used by our governor, but it wasn't built for a United States governor. It was built for a Spanish governor. And how was Spain? When we talk about empires, the Roman Empire was big, but not compared to the Spanish Empire. That's huge. The British Empire, that's huge. The French Empire, these were all larger than the Roman Empire. And the reason that they could grow to this size is because of the use of letters, being able, the cheapness of paper, that people could send bureaucracies, could build bureaucracies and send letters and forms back and forth through the nobility and through and to even the regents, the kings, the emperors, in order to have really functional governments that spanned huge distances that never could have been built using papyrus. And so this was a huge thing. And so the rhetoricians of this time, the people who were really interested in the belles lettres movement, we considered kind of the belles lettres to be the beginning of modern communication. They started to get, we're not in the classical period anymore, we're in the modern period. They started to get really interested in the canons of style and arrangement. Now, these have been set pretty well by the Romans, but you know, style can get so much better if you can think for a while about the word that you choose before you use it. And they really focused on writing. Well, the word belles lettres means beautiful letters. They're really focused on making things really beautiful. And arrangement, there's an idea in arrangement, but just like I'm delivering this presentation orally. So there have been a few times where I've wanted to go into something, oh yeah, but I forgot this. But when I'm writing and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot this, I go back and rewrite it. I put it back where it would fit better. And this idea of putting things together in a perfect arrangement was really developed fully by some of these writers in the belletristic movement. Beauty and the beauty and the sublime, they called it, which is like an overwhelming, almost unpleasant kind of beauty. That's wrong, but it gives you kind of an idea. It's this like this amazing thing. Beauty and the sublime became really, really important. We have some really brilliant thinkers at this time, brilliant writers who really show us how to develop taste. Hugh Blair was one that was really interested in concepts of taste. And taste, not like just like you taste food, but how to really taste it, how to develop a kind of a universal taste that, you know, the taste could be right or wrong. That your idea, you know, it's not like just beauty is in the idea of the beholder. There are ways to understand beauty, and we can apply that then to our writing. And so this is a really important thing that really began the modern era, this discovery of paper. Of course, that was vastly expanded just a few years later. Technological change starts to really increase then. The second technology that really pushed the study of communication forward even more was the invention of the printing press. The printing press by Gutenberg. Again, they kind of had printing presses in China, although they weren't as sturdy as what Gutenberg put forth as his invention. But there were printing presses in China. But this idea of applying rhetoric to the printing press is really, really important, and getting ideas out there and putting these things out there. One of the first thing that was printed on the printing press was the Bible. I've been lucky. I was able to look at one of those Bibles printed, and I was actually able to go to the Old Testament and find my name, Benjamin. And I took a picture of it. As I don't know if it was the first Bible, it was one of the first Bibles. But one of the very first times my name was in print, in 1439, because in print didn't exist before that. So I took a picture of my name. In the very first time in Genesis, where it was first in print. Of course, it wasn't referring to me. So, but really cool. Now, the interesting thing about this is with the printing press, you're able to, previously, even if there's something was written down, if there was a Bible, you kind of had the one person in town who could read, had that Bible. It's not like you could take it home with you. And this is true of like Aristotle and Cicero and all of these others too, that now you could start to interpret them by themselves. And this act of doing it by yourself, remember, is really focuses on the canon of invention. How can we know what is true? Well, we can know what is true by what is proved. And there's two different kinds of proof. There's the inartistic and the artistic proof that we already talked about. How do you know that these inartistic proofs are real? And how can we trust those things that come from inside us? And people like Francis Bacon, René Descartes, John Locke, Giambattista Vico really wrestled with these ideas of how can we know the truth? And that's what epistemologist really means. Is you say something is epistemic, meaning it's our method for understanding what's true. And that's really what the canon of invention is all about. And so there was a lot of real focus on improving logic, on the place of reason and emotion. David Hume is one of these guys, I don't have him listed up there, who said that emotion is more important than logic. People like John Locke would have really, really disagreed with him on that. These ideas are circulating as to how these internal and external proofs can be understood best. And this is really because we can actually look at those external proofs for the first time. And we can actually consider those. Whereas before, you had to be one of the wealthy scholars who could actually go to the library. The last technology that was really super important is the steam engine. The steam engine allowed for the locomotive and the steamboat. And what those did that were really important is they made it so that a speaker could go from one place to another and deliver their ideas to a lot of people. And so they started to think about, if you're going to be doing this over and over, how is it that you can get ideas across the best way? And so you would have these highly practiced speeches, these almost performances, a lot of times out of this elocutionary period. We call this the elocutionary period. We see a real tie between theater and speech, where people would learn really precise ways to gesture, move and hold their mouths in order to do this. And this is really important. A lot of our ideas about delivery, and when you look at some of these other videos, and you see me talking about nonverbal communication, it comes out of this era where there was a lot of careful study of how we can communicate more clearly. And then we call those the elocutionists, and they did all these careful studies. And part of the reason was they could go and deliver these same speeches as a kind of entertainment. You know, you'd step off the locomotive, or you would step off the steam engine, step out onto the platform, and deliver a speech for those present, get back on, and people would want to be held in by these great speakers. And we do have some great speakers at those times. You know, you have Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, these really, really great public speakers who come out and are able to deliver their ideas to huge audiences because they're able to go to all of these people physically by steam engine. Now, of course, in what we call the postmodern era, we don't go physically to people. There's some real question about when postmodern communication started to really be the way we do things. Some people started with the telegraph in 1844, the radio in 1897, or TV in 1939. Somewhere in there, things changed. And they changed because we could communicate now at the speed of light. And communicating at the speed of light let us in on some things. See, we now expand the study of rhetoric, of communication, not just to public speaking, but to all texts. We talk about radio, we talk about TV, we'll talk about music, we'll talk about internet, all of these things as part of communication. We started to figure out that rhetoric wasn't just about persuasion, which we really focused on since Aristotle, but it was about building identity. And if you can get people to see you as being like them, then persuasion can follow. But it's almost like persuasion is a secondary act. We started to combine rhetorical thinking with semiotics, with social sciences, and with hermeneutics. These are all different ways that different things have been studied. Semiotics is really the study of words and how words develop meaning. The social sciences are like statistical concepts, like if I use this concept, how many people are going to be moved by it? We started to look at that. And hermeneutics is, how is it that we develop meaning? How is it that you give a speech to me and I come to an understanding that's similar to something that somebody else would come to when we all have our private interpretations? How is it we can get to that? We began to see that rhetoric uses us as much as we use it. That means we don't just use it to identify and to persuade and to move people, but it uses us. The words that we use are the means by which we develop a reality, that we understand reality. And we began to see that media alters messages. That it is a different experience to go to a play or than to watch TV. It's a different experience to own the CD and to go to the concert. CDs are probably old. To have it on MP3 or to go to the concert. These are different experiences. That we have a different epistemology. I remember that word that I used just a little bit ago. We have a different reality that we experience, a different kind of truth that we experience, depending on the means by which a message is delivered to us. They started to understand that the world, as far as we can understand it, is rhetorically constructed. That doesn't mean the world is rhetorically constructed. That doesn't mean if all the human beings died tomorrow, everything that uses language, that the world would also stop existing too. And that it would have that big of an effect at all on mountain lion out in the Gila wilderness. Probably would. Might not even know all the human beings are gone. But the world, as far as we can understand it, is rhetorically constructed. Our understanding of the world comes from the way that we put language together. Started to realize that culture and rhetoric are creators of each other, that rhetoric doesn't just create culture and culture doesn't just bring forth rhetoric, but they kind of co-create each other. And so you tend to believe things that are believable in your culture. Rhetoric creates unfair systems of domination and oppression. Rhetoric created racism. I'll talk about that in some of the other videos that I do here. That there was a day in which racism was invented. Really, Bacon's Rebellion invented racism, and before that, that hadn't really been the case. We created racism, and why did we create racism? We created race in order to be racist, and it pulls those same systems down. Not interested in issues of power because of that, since we can create and deny systems of domination and oppression. How is power created in communication? Started to deal with concepts of mass rhetoric. Aristotle never had any concept of, there weren't a billion people on the earth when Aristotle was writing. The idea that we could communicate to all the people that we communicate with when we do a Super Bowl ad is something that's really different and is going to have different effects and different goals. I mean, honestly, if Pizza Hut ran a Super Bowl commercial and everybody who watched that bought a pizza, the Pizza Hut couldn't handle it, right? It just wouldn't work. So that's not the goal. Where the goal of old rhetoric might be to get everybody who listens to follow you. Now we can have a goal of like 1 or 2% and be really happy about that. And coming to terms with corporate rhetoric. Corporate rhetoric is a really interesting idea. When concepts don't come from an individual, they come from large groups of people who are producing ideas. And this is something that is really different in communication at the speed of light than communication previous to the speed of light. So here's what we talked about. We talked about the classical, and that's what I spent the most time on, and you can see why it's the longest time there. We talked about what we call the modern period, the belles lettres, the epistemologists, and the elocutionists. And we talked about the postmodern era right now, where communication is moving at the speed of light and we're really expanding our understanding of what it is. So thank you. If you listen to the full hour and 45 minutes of this, which is going to be a little bit more, thank you for your time. If you had to break that up, that's great. And if you didn't, if you just watched part of it or just got interested in some of it, that's really wonderful too. I want to thank you for listening to me. This is just my quick little, when you have that many thousand, when you have a couple thousand years tucked into a couple of hours, I think that's really doing pretty good. So if you've watched this, I think you have a good understanding of what the history of communication is and what we're doing in communication now. So again, I thank you very much for listening to this. If you want to subscribe to my YouTube channel, there might be other stuff like this. There's also just going to be funny pictures of my videos about my daughter, and maybe just stuff I put up there because I'm interested in it, technological stuff like that. So anyway, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for being a part of this, and have a pleasant day.